Britney Spears could be a step closer to ending her conservatorship. Today, a Los Angeles judge will hear arguments about whether her father should be removed as conservator or if the arrangement should end altogether. Britney's lawyer filed a new petition earlier this week to remove Jamie Spears. He cited a New York Times report which says Britney's father monitored her phone communications and bugged her bedroom. A new Netflix documentary called Britney versus Spears also reveals new information from confidential court documents about the extent of the control over the singer. Erin Lee Carr, the director and producer of that documentary, spoke earlier today with CBS Mornings.
I think a lot of people in America suffer from mental health issues and they're not put in a conservatorship. So you really have to look at the motives of this. And it is highly unusual that someone her age,
yes.
And also the film goes into this this question of she had dementia because Jamie Spears, her father, checked that on a box at the early part of the conservatorship. So understanding what is truth, what is fiction, and what does Britney think about it.
To talk more about this, I'd like to bring in Morgan Whitlatch. She is the legal director at the Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities. Morgan, welcome. So what are the options the judge will be considering as, he or she considers if and how this conservatorship should move forward?
I think that this hearing that we're going to be having today is going to focus on mostly the question associated with who should be her conservator and whether or not it should be Jamie Spears, Britney's father. I think that is the petition that's really being considered today. And while there has been a lot of talk within pleadings about termination of the conservatorship, I think that her counsel has made pretty clear that the first and foremost on her mind is to get her father removed as her conservator. And I think that has to do in part with the fact that she's negotiating a prenuptial agreement for her engagement, and she does not want her father to be part of that process. So I really do anticipate that's going to be the focus of the hearing. Technically, she hasn't officially moved to terminate the conservatorship, and in the most recent filing, her counsel said that would be anticipated later in the fall.
So if the judge were to remove Jamie Spears but keep the conservatorship in place, what would this mean for Britney Spears moving forward? Would she have any control over who steps in as her conservator?
Well, actually, in the petition that was filed shortly after her attorney became her attorney and she was allowed to choose who she wanted to have be her attorney, there was a CPA that was nominated already to take the place in terms of the conservatorship over her finances from her father. And so I anticipate that that's who would likely be considered to be able to replace Mr. Spears. However, the judge may disagree and decide that it should be someone else who would take over that role. So that would be what would happen if the actual conservatorship is not terminated today.
Would the judge just appoint someone out of the blue, or would this person have to be someone that came forward as a potential conservator? I'm unclear how that would happen if it's not the person that Britney Spears' lawyer puts forward.
So Britney Spears' lawyer put forth Jason Rubin, who's a CPA in the pleading. However, there are, organizations in California and trust organizations that do serve as conservators. So that could, we don't know yet whether or not there's a different conservator that's in mind or that Mr. Spears would request to be replace him. So it is up in the air in terms of ultimately who would be the person who would be tasked with taking over that conservatorship, because Mr. Spears has not consented, I believe, to Jason Rubin serving in that role.
Okay, so you say it's unlikely the judge will completely dissolve the conservatorship, at least in this hearing. But let's say the judge does decide to end the conservatorship. What would the next steps be for Britney Spears?
Well, just to go to your first point, I think the reason why I think it's unlikely that the conservatorship will be terminated is, in my years of experience, I have not seen a guardianship or conservatorship terminated in the instance where there is no medical evaluation or psychological evaluation that's been completed, and I don't believe one has been completed in this particular case. A lot of state processes require that kind of proof before termination of a guardianship or conservatorship. What would happen if the conservatorship was terminated? Well, then Ms. Spears would have the option to use voluntary tools to assist her and manage her affairs. She may decide, for example, to use a power of attorney if she wants someone to assist her with that, or she might want to make her own financial decisions with the support of people she trusts, using supported decision making. It kind of opens the way to use the other legal tools, and there are lots of them out there to manage her finances. And then we also have to remember that Ms. Spears has a second conservator, and that second conservator is the person who's really managing her personal and medical matters, that's separate from Mr. Spears. And so with respect to that, we have to look more closely at what could be those voluntary tools that would be used to support her with those medical decisions. So there really are two conservatorships that are in place here. And I think a lot of people are focused on Mr. Spears, but there is also a medical conservatorship in place.
All right. Well, Morgan Whitlatch, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us on this. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.